All right, we're just going to go ahead and begin in the next minute or two. We're going to give everybody an extra couple of minutes to go ahead and join here. I think people are still joining, so we'll just give one more minute and we'll go ahead and begin. Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin. So hopefully you all can hear me. So good morning and or afternoon. Welcome to the part 2 of the multi-part series covering key topics associated with GDPR. Today we are going to be discussing the privacy impact assessment and really key tips for conducting that assessment and what it looks like as a whole. So I am Christina Whiting. I am the Managing Director of our Privacy, Risk, and Compliance Practice Areas at Tevora. I am joined today by David Grazer, who is our Security and Privacy Consultant and leads up our privacy practice. He's really going to be going through the content today, which I am going to help facilitate. So please, as we go through the content, go ahead and write your questions in. Either during in the questions section or in the chat session. I will be monitoring that queue throughout the duration of our webinar today. So please go ahead, as you have questions, write them in because I will stop David at key points so that we can cover it as we're going over that key content itself. And so with that, I will hand it over to David so we can go ahead and begin.
All right, well, thank you to everyone for joining us. Just a quick tech check here. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. And everyone can hear me? We're good on that point?
Everybody's saying yes.
All right, perfect. There we go. Okay. So the agenda for today is threefold. We're going to go over what is a PIA, or a Privacy Impact Assessment, steps to conducting a PIA, and then third is going to be the next steps to comply with GDPR and at a more of a global scale for the upcoming data protection regulations across the globe. But the first thing that Christine and I really wanted to drive home is Tevora's approach to privacy. Our approach is to take it from a holistic and cross-functional perspective. We believe that a solid privacy team is built of legal, security, and business units. And we look at privacy and risk as the drivers of the security and your security or data protection strategy.
And so that's definitely key, and we want to highlight that because as we go over, what the PIA is and what does it mean to GDPR, that's really going to be a core fundamental concept that we're going to be discussing. So it's really around cross-collaboration. So we're going to continuously reiterate that throughout our discussion.
Okay, so what is the PIA? So the big conversations around GDPR right now are what's the difference between a PIA and a DPIA. And for us, they're essentially the same process, and there are very minimal differences. So what we want to focus on is the intent of the process. We want to focus on assessing the privacy implications within your organization, rather than get caught up in what we're dubbing acronyms to. It's much like what we've been saying about GDPR. It's not just about one specific regulation and the EU member states. It's about global, this transformation into new global data protection precedents. So therefore, conducting the PIA is then going to help inform what and set your data protection strategy.
Yeah, so in essence, PIA that we're going to be discussing today is really, the key components of the DPIA. So all the same things, so we don't need to get caught up in, what is what and what are the differences between the two.
Okay. So for everyone who joined us for the first webinar, will remember this slide, but for those who haven't, we want to just to kind of reiterate it. So we've pointed out or highlighted 5 key priorities for preparation towards the May 2018 deadline. So you have the first one, which is the data mapping, the PIA, which is a critical component, which is what we're talking about today. You also have the discussions around who your third-party providers are, your processors, any particular certifications or frameworks you want to align to, data retention strategy, and then understanding who your particular supervisory authority or enforcement authority is. We're more used to it being called here in the United States. Okay, so here's just a quick overview or primer of what is the PIA. So the initial step to the PIA is really data mapping. So data mapping enables your organization to identify, localize, and remove or improve your data within your environment. That exercise produces a data inventory, and then that output can then be used to conduct your PIA. Best practice is going to be, or you're going to see the best benefits out of these exercises if you're doing it continuously, not just for GDPR, but for a healthy data environment for your organization. So the PIA takes the output from that data mapping process exercise and helps your organization understand the privacy risks and consideration that must be addressed when you're defining a new product, process, or service. And those are key terms that are brought up in the GDPR regulation, but key terms that kind of help to enforce this idea of privacy by design that we want to continue to kind of formalize within the organization. So considering the proliferation of data within the environment, being proactive with these assessments on your environment is going to provide that sensible risk management that organizations need in the new modern digital marketplace. Okay, so the GDPR calls out some specific areas where you should consider performing a PIA or a DPIA. So the first one is prior to the processing of data that can be deemed sensitive, in areas where the processing is used to make decisions or construct a profile. And they're calling out the special categories of data. And remember that the biometric, the heightened personal health information, criminal conviction data, those types of pieces. They're talking about where publicly accessible areas are being monitored. So think about office conference rooms or busy potential intersections. if you're providing some type of government service or product, or when a public authority, body, or group is launching some platform for processing data, industry-wide. And, those, and when should these really be performed is.
So let's table that for a second, when, they should be performed, because we do have a couple of questions up here regarding, the last couple of sections of, who should perform it, and really, just basics about data mapping and PIA. And so, the question is, what is termed processing operation, as GDPR calls it, really under data mapping and the PIA?
Yeah, so those are the automated or the manual processing practices that you have in place. So think about, that help you deliver as an organization a service or a product. So genome sequencing is something we're going to continue to hear about. So that is a processing operation. Trends in customer transactions, order fulfillment, across e-commerce platforms. Utilizing that consumer data that you collect to inform your, B2C or B2B, marketing campaigns. So that's kind of those operations. And remember, processing in these terms is any action that's taken on the data. So it can be significant, or it can be relatively minor.
Okay. Perfect. Another question that came up is, obviously, this particular webinar and focus is really all about the privacy impact assessment, but do I really need to do this, the PIA, in order to become GDPR compliant and maintain my compliance for GDPR?
Yeah, so the short answer and the honest answer is no. You don't need to do it, but you're going to want to perform some type of an assessment of this nature that helps show how the privacy program was built, the controls that were implemented, and the rationale that you used to kind of develop that strategy, and then the rationale to kind of show what is and isn't in scope for GDPR. And then again, this starts to lend towards that formalizing of privacy by design, even security by design, and sensible risk management within your organization, and kind of make that a little more informal and kind of inherent in the way that you do business.
Okay, so essentially, to kind of summarize, while a PIA isn't needed in order to become GDPR compliant, it's almost seen as a necessary step, because for external entities that may challenge you to determine, say, how do you know this is really effectively your scope of where your data is, what it looks like, what you're doing, that PIA is really that foundational component and continuous process of ensuring you're covering the right scope for the privacy requirements that are set.
Precisely.
Okay, all right, perfect.
Yeah, and then and just to kind of finish up on this slide, when should you be performing these? So these privacy assessments should, best practice, should be built into your SDLC process the same way that you take into consideration security. Any new initiative that's going to involve the collection of data at this point should really include a privacy assessment. Any due diligence included in type of a mergers and acquisitions activity. The vendor management process, that should be included within your security review questionnaire. And then you should do it hopefully at least annually. Again, doesn't necessarily matter if you have to do it by GDPR, it's just good practice in this data environment today.
Okay, so, to help provide a little bit of clarification around that on when you should be performing the PIA, and the point that we're trying to really get across is this doesn't need to be a one-time event. So most organizations have built a risk-based approach to evaluating processes, protocols, controls, et cetera. And so the idea is you follow that exact same framework of when you evaluate risk in an organization, you evaluate the privacy of that process, of that product, of that decision. And so you can almost mirror whenever you're evaluating risk, evaluate privacy. And so that's why like the key steps that we put in here really says, build it into your SDLC process because security is built in. So when security is built in, you should assume that now ask a couple of questions or include, legal or compliance, et cetera, whoever is responsible for privacy in that discussion around data. And, whenever there's any merger or acquisition activity, we've been helping organizations really define and modify their process to really include privacy triggers within what they're asking, when they're asking it, to really understand the full scope of how does this really impact, the merging of systems or the acquisition of that organization and their ability to meet various privacy compliance areas. Within the vendor management, procurement, third-party management process, again, you're doing a risk evaluation, security review. Add in those privacy-related questions that have triggers, into legal, privacy, compliance, the various components in the organization. So that way, you're just building it into an existing process. You don't have to create something from scratch. It's actually better that you implement this, PIA, not as a one-time event. You can do it the first time to understand what your baseline activity is in the organization, but ingrain it into existing processes. You don't need to create something new.
Yeah.
That way, you are continuously feeding into what does your environment look like from a privacy perspective? What type of data is being collected, and is there anything that's changing based on, as we were describing a couple minutes ago, what that data mapping looks like? So think about that of not just a PIA as a one-time event, but ingrain it into existing processes that you're already using to evaluate risk or security. So you're not duplicating efforts and you're not adding overhead into your organization as a whole, but still getting that primary benefit.
Yeah, in most cases, it's a natural maturity to the processes that exist currently, and will again help inform and kind of mature your security tactics and your risk tactics moving forward.
Perfect. So a couple of questions before we leave this and go to the next section. So one of the questions is, what is really meant by processing of data?
Yeah, so the processing of data is any action that is taken upon the personal data you collect within the environment. So any change that you take to any piece of data, now that can be manual or it can be kind of automated, and it kind of, that's what I was saying, it blends into the processing operations component. The operations is the larger idea of how you're processing. Where processing is just that act of analyzing or extracting some trend or pattern from the data you're collecting to deliver your service or product.
Okay, perfect. And then the other question that we have here is, really under, when GDPR says you should perform a, BPIA, there's this term, publicly accessible areas. So really what is meant when we say where publicly accessible areas are being monitored?
Yeah, so these are the areas where public citizens, are going to frequent, right? So these can be anything from, we're talking about public authorities or larger organizations. So it could be a busy intersection if you're monitoring, streetlights or whatever that could be. Various areas in an office. We've talked about some of the key areas around GDPR and personnel data and all of that, or just other areas within your business where data could be collected.
Okay. Perfect. All right. And definitely let us know if we're not directly answering the question that you're asking. Just go ahead and, again, put it in the chat session or the question section, and I'll go ahead and we can expand on any of these, during the session itself.
So steps to conducting the PIA. There are 4 main steps. The first one is defining your data mapping process, and this is actually something that we have constructed and called out in blog posts on the Tevora blog. So you can go ahead and take a look at that as well. as well as we actually defined, stepping back, we defined a timeline for the 5 key priorities, kind of where organizations can be to kind of start aligning to that May 2018 deadline. But really, the data mapping process is going to have 3 key areas. It's going to have a data identification, socialization component, finding where the data is, and then kind of understanding why it exists within that organization. There's a continuous improvement on the data lifecycle, and then there's the data minimization and the purge process. And data minimization, as we all know, is pretty key to GDPR and its goals, but it's asking why you're collecting, do you really need it, and then starting to extract a lot of that information or data within your environment. Now, one of the best ways to conduct a PIA is going to be through kind of a 2-pronged process. The data mapping process is going to be through an analog assessment as well as an automated assessment. And these are key to work in tandem. So you have the, pardon me with that. So you have the analog, and that's more of the questionnaires, the interviews. That's enabling you to go and find people in your organization, key stakeholders, subject matter experts who understand what data is being collected, how and why, rough estimations. It also enables you to identify your privacy champions and your security champions in your organization. And again, that's kind of engendering that development of an inherent privacy by design viewpoint within your organization. And then coupling that with utilizing some of the technological tools that are out there. So the big IDs of the world, OneTrust, Splunk, other tools that can help assist with quantifying and localizing and just kind of confirming what actually is being said in interviews is actually the only pieces of information or data that are being collected within your environment. Because understanding and having a clean, inventory of your data is going to be key to this. And then it's taking those outputs, putting them together into a report that you guys have defined within your organization, and then presenting that and then performing the PIA on that information.
Perfect. So, we have a question here. Is data mapping required by GDPR, or is a record of processing activity really an inventory enough? Or is it the same thing?
It's not necessarily the same thing. It's not required. We're calling out data mapping and the creation of the data inventory as a proactive or strategic approach to conducting a successful PIA. It's really hard to extract the two if you don't have a clear understanding of what is actually existing within your environment. There could be systems that certain business units are utilizing, and we'll talk about this in other areas on other slides here today. But it's the shadow IT kind of component. If you don't know what's in your environment, you can't protect against it. You don't know what the privacy implications could be, the risk considerations, or the security implications as well. And that record of the data processing record is, a way to, it's an input, that you can assess and utilize in the PIA. But we would say that's only an element, not a sole data mapping process or source of truth.
Yeah, so, to that point then, I would say that the record of processing activities, depending upon how you have your inventory documented, so if it's not just around the processing activity itself, but goes down to the data level so you understand what data is collected, where it's being stored, how it's being used within those processing activities, then I would say, yeah, you can use that instead of calling it a data mapping, because essentially you are doing a data mapping. You're doing it at the process level, which then goes down into the details of what data is being used to support those processes as a whole as part of that inventory. So however you want to call it, if you want to use that as your, record of processing activity versus the data mapping exercise, absolutely, as long as the end result is getting you what you need to identify exactly what data you're using, where it's stored, who's using it, and how long it's stored for.
Yep. All right. So these four elements are really the four big factors of the PIA that we kind of wanted to address. They're the key pieces of information you're trying to collect and define. And you don't want to leave these stones unturned, because these will guide your strategy or your data protection tactics moving forward. So it's really, do we collect sensitive data, and do we need it? There are various categories of sensitive data called out within GDPR. We won't go into every category, but understanding that if you have, a lot of health data, but you are a financial institution, or that doesn't necessarily, you're a marketing analytics company or whatever it may be, maybe you don't need all of that health information, and maybe it's on your roadmap and that's a risk that you're willing to accept. It's just having those strong strategic conversations that this process is supposed to enable. Again, it's then also, where does that data reside? Is that data in the US? Is that data staying put within the EU's boundaries? Or is it, a combination of both? Having those risk evaluation components that we need to do to understand what's in scope for each and every organization's GDPR.
And it's also good to know, what country within the EU the data is being stored, because as we all know, there are certain countries that have requirements above and beyond even GDPR, and so you are bound to go ahead and protect that data according to that country's laws, if it supersedes or if it's more stringent than GDPR as a whole. And so it's important to know not just, where does your data reside by EU or US, it's note by country, so that you can appropriately plan the controls that need to be implemented or the minimization or protection measures based on even local requirements that go above and beyond.
Precisely. And then we brought this up, in a previous slide, but just kind of to reinforce it. This process, these exercises are really supposed to also help identify any shadow IT. And we're defining shadow IT broadly in this sense, basically anything that some of the key stakeholders within your privacy program who are stewarding this assessment may not have been aware of. Because again, you can't protect data that you don't know is there, and if it's existing on systems that maybe didn't go through a typical, purchasing or procurement process, you just need to know and account for these things moving forward, because they could very well be in scope for GDPR.
Common areas of that, when we look at shadow IT, and it's not even, really classified as shadow IT, it's really cloud environments. Cloud environments can easily be spun up by particular product areas, business units, et cetera, in order to, develop or support some kind of emerging, business objective. That I would factor that into not really shadow IT, but in this context within there, because you do need to understand, where your data is residing at all times, even if it's temporary for a day or two, or if it's long term. But absolutely, these are all, four key things that as you're conducting that data mapping, as you're conducting the privacy impact assessment, to clearly ask and understand, because these are common things that we're seeing that aren't necessarily captured or part of the discussion point in order to truly understand the impact of GDPR in the organization in order to develop next steps.
Yeah. And another area is product development, R&D, those types of areas.
Exactly.
And then the last factor is you want to make sure that you're developing some type of risk scoring methodology, and it's not necessarily a precise science. You can use a variety of methodologies to however you as an organization want to kind of score your risk, but it helps to prioritize what's, the high, the medium, or the low, or the critical, and then directing initiatives to now protect that data, excise that data from the environment, whatever it may be, is a key component to this. And another couple points that we wanted to make sure that we point out is that the PIA is not supposed to be a contentious activity. Bigger organizations with a lot of different units in disparate areas, you want to approach this with care and understanding that each function has a reasoning and objective for the way that they operate. And we're just trying to make the organization that much safer and more resilient in this, growing risk landscape, we'll call it, in protecting data globally. So, you keep this in mind, you're going to find naturally those privacy and security champions, and we will continue to harp on finding those people that are outside of the traditional InfoSec teams, risk teams, is going to be key to, getting privacy by design in place. Those are key points for us.
Absolutely. So, the one thing that I want to mention though is, a lot of people have a misconception on the PIA and the data mapping process and really what that foundation looks like and what is the amount of time in order to conduct this and how long should we spend on it in order to move to the next phase. What I would tell you is this is not supposed to be a brunt of your privacy program development or your GDPR compliance efforts. It is supposed to be the foundation. So, the term that I always use is plan enough in order to act. So you don't need a perfect plan in place in order to understand 100% of your population in order to start acting on your privacy program as a whole. And so don't get bogged down into the details of, I literally have to cover everything in order to fully understand my environment in order to move forward, because that will be your Achilles heel. Because we do see organizations get stuck in this planning phase in perpetuity, so that way they never actually get to the act phase of implementing their privacy program and start to implement controls or this risk-based approach of what actually needs to be in place in order to meet GDPR. So I don't want, I want to make sure that you don't get paralyzed in this planning phase so that you can move forward with the overall intent of GDPR, which is really the minimization and protection of data.
So in talking to a variety of clients, working with clients on developing their privacy programs, security programs, in a comprehensive fashion, there's some things that we have found, some lessons learned that we wanted to just kind of bestow upon everyone. Christina already started hitting on the first tip, which is you don't want to get stuck in the planning phase, but you want to give yourself time. These processes can take a while. So if this is the first time, don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's showing those steps, and the more and more you do it, you refine your process. Each organization is going to have certain mechanics that they have to kind of work with.
Or politics.
Politics.
You're being nice.
I'm trying to be nice. Yeah.
The politics that you have to maneuver around. Absolutely.
Call it like it is. There's also the old school versus the new school. So it's remembering that technology in this is not going to solve all your problems. We had talked about the analog and the automated assessment techniques. So to make sure that you are leveraging those. Don't be afraid to step outside your silo, talk to people, understand, how they've been approaching, because certain product teams may actually be taking a lot more privacy into consideration than others, understanding how they've done it. What are those lessons learned? That's kind of the old school versus new school type of approach. And then kind of piggybacking off that is the third, which is broadly, to speak broadly. Don't just talk to the tech teams. Be willing to speak across, engineering all the way to HR and sales, and understand why everyone needs what they need, how they can do their job better. Do they really need all this data, or is it kind of just being stored and, we're paying excessive licensing fees monthly in the cloud, whatever it may be. Be willing to cross the aisle. Legal and security, should be involved in this, as well as the risk teams. You have a specified risk management team. Everyone should be involved with it. And then, again, we're talking about the establishment of these privacy champions and a committee. And, by going through this process, this assessment on a continuous basis, you're going to find people naturally who are going to do this at a daily, the daily basis. They're going to do this, on the ground, and they're not going to make this just an annual thing. They're going to make this annual process that much easier. And then the last thing is, this is not to tell you that you should start trying to reinvent the wheel. There are valuable resources out there. There are valuable, methodologies for scoring your risk, which most of you know. But there's also, some privacy impact assessment frameworks that are out there. ISO 22307, which is a fantastic framework. It's geared towards financial systems, but if you look at it from a broad perspective, it applies to everything that we're doing now. It applies across different industries and organization types and services. So it's definitely something to be willing to look at.
Okay, cool. We do have a question on, is there any indication whether or not GDPR will be applicable to the UK post-Brexit, or if the UK is developing another data privacy standard?
Yeah, so the UK has come out and stated that they will enforce this. Brexit won't exclude them from this process. This is a harmonizing regulation, which is a little interesting in the terms of Brexit, but they have said that they will enforce it. They've been a part of the development of it. But it also calls out again is that remember that while it's a harmonizing regulation across the EU member states, there are different thresholds, and it allows for leeway for each member state to apply this. So certain thresholds do exist that are more strict than others. Germany, France, and Spain are those. UK historically is not the most stringent. So make sure that you are looking beyond just what the UK is going to do in GDPR and what the broader and the more strict member states are doing. That's just kind of a proactive and a strategic approach to this.
Cool. Excellent.
Are there any other questions?
No other questions right now.
Okay. All right, so the next steps to comply here. So again, some that have been on our previous webinars have seen this slide before, but we've updated it. So we're about 189 days away from GDPR. But we do believe that what GDPR is going to do is create a competitive advantages for those that focus on it. Maybe GDPR is actually not in scope for you right now. But we have other regulations that are coming up behind it, or may actually have already hit their enforcement date. So kind of applying these as kind of a general framework or precedent is going to be a real competitive advantage. So, the privacy by design, focusing on partnerships. Our ecosystems are a lot more complex than they ever have been, whether it's, in the cloud or outsourced developers or, a variety of different components to our ecosystems to process data and to deliver the services that we are. Data minimization just enables that healthy environment that, you're not overrun by petabytes if you don't need it, that you can gain actionable insights, you can identify the trends that apply to your business now, and give you that advantage in your particular marketplace. It's forward-looking security, and if you are applying some of these GDPR principles back to the United States, we do believe that this is going to strengthen some of your customer retention, and in doing so, your brand equity. And that's never a bad thing.
Cool.
And then we also wanted to call out again, remember that there's a new cybersecurity law in China. That enforcement date is December of 2018. Australia has made updates. Canada continues to make updates to theirs. The Asia Pacific, economic cooperation, they have certain regulations around privacy. And then Japan's actually already started enforcing their privacy call-outs. So focusing on GDPR as that foundational piece to your global data protection program is really what we're advising and what we're trying to work with all of our clients to kind of craft that mindset and move forward in this new environment.
Yeah, and that's why, the privacy impact analysis, shouldn't just be centered around, GDPR. It's really centered around data holistically, what's being collected, those processes, what that inventory looks like. So that way, again, setting up that foundation, you do it once, and then, as long as you're ingraining, as we discussed, that evaluation of privacy risk, I guess you could call it, within the existing processes, like SDLC, vendor management, merger and acquisition, new products, new services. You have that set then for when or if you enter the China market, the APEC market, Canada, Australia, when these additional laws become effective. You already have that information by conducting that initial PIA, and you've ingrained key processes in existing procedures, so that way it's kept updated and a continual process as you see fit.
Yeah. Do we have
one question? So one question is, what is forward security? So if you can describe, what forward security is, because I know that was on like that slide to describe that a little bit more.
Proactive is what we mean. Looking forward with, it's that privacy or security by design kind of methodology or mindset that we're talking about. It enables you to kind of, it's looking deeper at your roadmap and saying, okay, well, we're going to develop this service or this process, and we're going to have to collect this type of data. It's having those discussions ahead of time, understanding, the technical implications, the business process implications, and then some of those regulatory implications that may exist with it. We're going to continue to come up, as computing power, becomes that much more impressive and complex. We're going to be able to collect different types of data. So it's being forward-looking and not becoming complacent with where we are today, but where we're moving.
So it's building that holistic security strategy that can accommodate and evolve with, growing regulation, privacy requirements, and the like, so that way you're not constantly reacting to what's being circulated out through regulation, but you have a solid program that is, in this instance, we've turned forward-looking security. So that way you can be on the proactive side of the fence versus the reactive side. Another question is, is this specifically part of GDPR or just a logical step for mature organizations? So in regards to security, so security is part of GDPR. There are specific requirements that are called out that says you must have reasonable assurance that security controls are in place in order to protect the data that you are collecting and leveraging. In addition to having an appropriate risk management program that feasibly identifies how you are protecting that information, of which then goes into making sure that you have a program in place that is proactively, again, that forward-looking security, proactively identifying the risks that could pose a threat to the data or the collection of data, the storage of data, and the sharing of data, in order to meet the various requirements associated with GDPR. So it's not, forward security is not specifically called out in GDPR as a line item. However, there are a series of requirements surrounding GDPR that literally have these broad stroke statements around appropriate security controls and measures risk assessment, procedures and protocols. And so that's where this concept of forward-looking security is a key step in, meeting GDPR compliance. Let me see.
Any other questions?
There's a couple, let me read through. So one question this is a good question. GDPR requires a data protection officer. We are governed by HIPAA in the US. Would that be equivalent to my privacy officer? So I would say it depends while David's thinking here, because I know there's a certain requirement. So it depends on the credentials of your privacy officer. So the answer could be yes. So GDPR calls out specific requirements of what the qualifications are for that data protection officer to be considered that under GDPR. So if your privacy officer has a certain set of experience, certifications, background, et cetera, they could very well be that same person. However, if it is, and I'm not saying this is the case, but I know in a lot of organizations, whether it be HIPAA or regulatory requirements around financial institutions, some organizations have a privacy officer that is noted on paper and as part of their roles and responsibilities, but they don't have any background associated with practicing privacy. They know best practices, but they don't necessarily have the credentials in order to back that up or the experience to back that up. And so under GDPR, that latter scenario I was just describing, that privacy officer wouldn't be able to be considered the designated data protection officer for that organization.
Yeah, but it's also not to say, one of the key components to GDPR is it calls out, in particular with the DPO. And, we'll also say that as GDPR is a new regulation, it's evolving. Some of the DPO requirements that it calls out are a little strict and a little restricting to the business. It does say that if the data processing is not a core activity that your business does, you can utilize a shared DPO or a virtual DPO. So that could be, just utilizing an outsourced service, someone who has that specific EU data protection background that can give you that guidance, and then work with your privacy officers in the state to kind of assess certain components there.
Yeah, so we do actually get a lot of questions around the data protection officer and its relevancy to distinct privacy officer designation. So, based on the number of questions that we've been getting, especially recently, I think that calls out for what we'll do is, next steps on this, because we do actually have a few more questions that relate exactly to this from a privacy officer versus data protection officer. We'll go ahead and create a blog post dedicated to just this so we can explain what the differences are to kind of help clarify in a little bit more detail for everyone to reference.
Perfect. Of course.
But yeah, those are the rest of the questions that are up here, is really that relevancy to privacy officer versus DPO, which makes perfect sense because I think there's a lot of confusion or misnomers out there. So with that, we thank everyone for your time today. We will go ahead and share the slide deck with everyone later this afternoon. But in the meantime, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or David. Please, take a look out for our next webinar that will be sometime in December regarding a legal panel of, intellectual property and privacy lawyers in regards to GDPR, its effects, and what it looks like. So stay tuned for that as it comes out in December. Cool.
Thank you all very much. Have a happy Thanksgiving.